Thomas Moran was a landscape artist from the Hudson River School period and the Luminism period. Born on February 12, 1837, in what was then Lancashire in northwest England, Moran, pictured here by Napoleon Cerroni, was one of the influential figures in decisions to make Yellowstone a national park, with his captivating painting, The Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. First, let's look at how his story began. Thomas's parents were weavers, but industrialization pushed them to move to Kensington, Philadelphia, when the Industrial Revolution took over in England. At age 16, Moran became an apprentice to a wood engraving firm called Scattersgood and Telfer. At this time, he began focusing on watercolor and illustrations in his time at the shop. His brother Edward was an aspiring marine painter, and so, after 3 years, he left his apprenticeship early to join his brother in training as a painter. It was at this time that Moran met Edward's good friend and associate, James Hamilton. Hamilton, described as the American Turner, is ascribed to possibly introducing Moran to the work of J.M.W. Turner. J.M.W. Turner was a well-known English painter that Moran seemed to model his painting style after and spent his life and passion to. A few images of J.M.W. Turner's work are shown here to demonstrate the similarities in style to the viewer. In the early 1860s, Moran traveled to Lake Superior with Edward to paint the Great Lakes. He sold these paintings and then traveled to London to see the great lithographs. While traveling there, the director of the National Gallery was so impressed by Moran's work that he gave him a private room to work on his replication paintings. After this, he returned home, but was said to always be looking for his next chance to travel on an expedition. A sizable gap is noticed between this and Moran's next exhibition trip. This may have been in part due to the American Civil War that spanned from 1861 to 1865. Other well-known events that occurred between this gap were Abraham Lincoln's assassination, the drafting of the 14th Amendment, the start-up of the Ku Klux Klan, women's suffrage, the Great Chicago Fire, and many other important political events. In 1871, he was given this opportunity to travel again. On the Ferdinand V. Hayden's Geological Survey expedition, Moran was hired alongside William Henry Jackson, a noted photographer of the age, to take photos and paintings of the land. During this expedition, Moran painted one of his best-known pieces, The Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. This painting was deemed masterful in its execution and large size, spanning 14 feet by 8 feet, and was instrumental in Congress's decision to make Yellowstone the first national park. This painting was sold in the same year to Congress for a gargantuan sum of $10,000 for the time period standards. Thomas forever carried Yellowstone with him, changing his signature to TYM, or Thomas Yellowstone Moran. Shortly after the success at Yellowstone, Moran went again on an expedition, accompanied by Jackson again, this time to the west on John Wesley Polk's expedition in 1874. During this trip, Moran painted the Chasm of Colorado, another famous painting that was sold to the Capitol building for a $10,000 sum. He then traveled to Denver, and then to the Mountain of the Holy Cross, where he painted the chief contribution to the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. With the money he made on these trips, he traveled again to Europe, as well as to many other countries well into his 80s. He moved west and permanently settled in California. He still made frequent trips to Acorna and Laguna Pueblos to paint the local scenery there. Memorialized as the Dean of American Landscape Painters, Thomas Moran died of natural causes on August 25, 1926, in Santa Barbara, California. Thomas Moran's watercolor is remarkable in its capability to make you feel like you're looking through a picture book, at the same time as giving the sensation that you are actually there. Personally inspired by Thomas Moran's life and paintings, I wish to center my honors contract around his work, the goal of which was to review and reflect on Moran's life and work and attempt to create a painting of my own in his style based on the information I had gathered. To begin my review, I wish to detail my understanding of the different forms of Moran watercolor painting. For example, Moran has two distinct styles of watercolor painting. There is the well-known, highly detailed landscape paintings we know from his Yellowstone era, which were painted in either oil or watercolor, but he also painted in what I refer to as his more emotion-triggering paintings that were detailed with less precision and more loose styling that modeled certain J.N.W. Turner paintings. These paintings were still detailed in nature, but contained areas of lesser detail that were meant to capture emotion rather than image correctness. Moran was fond of this interpretation of reality, for while many of his paintings were based on real locations, they were usually also embedded with some form of imagination, or merged with other locations to capture the imagery of an area rather than one specific location. I decided that this emotion-based painting was something that would lean to my talents and experience level, yet I still wanted to keep an aspect of the detail Moran was so well known for, in my efforts to paint in his style. I selected a range of pictures I felt captured elements of like photos Moran had painted. Upon conferencing with Professor Ndalin, I selected this photo, as it had elements of these areas that could be loose or tight depending on their distance or focus. Images such as these I used to draw an aspect of my image, based on pieces of paintings painted by Moran himself. For instance, for the distant cliffs I took example work from this painting, as the blue hues and foggy style was what I wished to capture in my faraway mountaintops. For the reflections, I used images such as this one, which use a clear wet-on-wet or blotting effect to create the illusion of a reflection on the water. Drawing upon elements of these paintings, I started into the process and experimentation segment of my project. First, I began by defining the issues of concern for this painting and the color palette I would hope to use. Three main elements stood out to me as being the areas of concern in this painting. First was the cliffs in the distance, which would require lesser detail but proper shadowing and color to create the illusion of distance. Second were the closer cliffs, requiring higher detail and contrast with a successful blend of blurry to definite tree lines from the distance trees residing on the mountain to those right on the water's surface. Finally, the reflection of trees in the water would require a wet-on-wet approach, with the same colors used on the tree line mixed with the shades of blue to create the illusion of a water surface. I discussed my palette observations, such as the presence of variety of blues in this photo and the necessity of a depth in tree coloration with Professor Ndalin through email and in person. He recommended these ideas as well as using a gray or blue wash over the mountains to throw them into the background when compared with a brighter front. He also made many suggestions such as using darker backgrounds to outline the tree line on the right side of the photo. Prior to this painting, I had never worked with mountain cliffs before, so using the reference photos of cliffs painted by Moran, I began experimenting with the light and darks of mountain cliffs. I also practiced scrubbing away clouds off of fresh paint, as the professor and I agreed that this was the best practice for this type of cloud. During our landscape painting in November, I selected a photo with a reflection to practice the wet-on-wet technique with defining shapes. In this, I found that setting specific shapes in the water prior to painting was too definite or restricting to the actual painting, and would cause the items to lay flatter than I would have hoped. Instead, I began practicing using a fully wet-on-wet painting technique and just dropping the paint onto the darker sections, avoiding any definite shaping. I used elements of my weekly assignments to practice elements and styling techniques I thought I might use or be relevant to my work in Moran's style. Whether it be shading, capturing elements of nature, or reflection work, I tried to find ways to incorporate those elements from my painting into my class time work. Finally, I decided it was time to begin the sketching process for the final painting. I was still somewhat nervous at this point and spent some time sketching the outline first onto a practice sheet. I referenced both a printout image and the online image to make sure I had the proper spacing in my sketch. Once I had the outline set forth, I transferred the painting onto the final paper and began painting. While I would usually start with the lightest colors of a painting, I wished to save the sky and the water for last. I put a base color coat of light green for the foliage, adding shadows where I felt necessary, and then I outlined parts of the cliff tops with green, but tried to remain focused on the base coat first. Next, I began mixing the grays I felt would fit for the cliff tops. Using this image, I tried to model styling off of Moran's mountain cliffs, adding detail where possible and leaving certain areas more blank or descriptionless. I kept this style while moving towards the back, hoping to grow more foggy in nature as the cliffs got farther away. I think it should be noted that per Professor Untalen's recommendation, I also made elements of the mountains more tan or yellowy at their base colors, as to mimic some of the palette we see in Moran's paintings. When I felt the cliffs were properly distanced in their planes, I decided to begin on the water. Moran's water was often very loose, something I tried to mimic in my water reflections and colors, while remaining semi-true to the colors put forth on the image itself. Using a similar blotting technique as that shown in this photo, I dropped in darker hues on top of the lighter base to create a reflection on the water. The sky was last. Using a paper towel and a wet-on-wet approach, I scrubbed out the clouds after laying the paint down to create the light, fluffy texture I desired. At this stage, I brought the painting to Professor Untalen. He reviewed and critiqued a few elements, at which point I put on the final touches and completed the painting. This is the finished result. I was very happy with the end result. I can see those elements I selected reflected clearly in example works of Moran, and I feel that overall the painting turned out well. If I were of Moran's skill level, I would go back in to fix the cliffs, to be more detailed, especially towards the front. I'm still unsure how he was able to find such sharp edges in his watercolor paintings, and I have an even greater respect for the skill he developed and demonstrated in his paintings. When reviewing this project in its entirety, I do think there would have been elements or approaches I would have changed in retrospect. However, I cannot attribute these changes to anything I would have known at the time, without first having gone through the process itself. I thought this project was very well-rounded in its ability to combine my usual research-driven work with a tangible effort made through painting in Thomas Moran's style. I cannot say whether I truly achieved this or not, but I can say that I stylistically reviewed and chose all elements of this painting after his style, and was pleased with how it turned out. I would recommend this type of project to other students aiming to get out of their comfort zone and try something new. As a supply chain management major who had never really had any training in painting or any watercolor experience, I am proud of my growth I saw throughout the semester, as well as the things I learned from my personal experience and Professor Untalen's wisdom and guidance. I hope that if Thomas Moran would see this project in its entirety, he could recognize the power of his work in inspiring a beginner such as myself to the love of landscape painting.